Yeah, wrong button. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of Get It for 2020. So, penultimate episode for the year, and once again, I'm privileged to have my friend Richard de Kock with us. We always have interesting discussions, and I think because we made of the same material, wooden spoons. Welcome, Richard. Sorry, I must unmute you. Welcome, Richard.
I just moved my lips. Catch you out there again.
Mate, it's good to have you on the show again. And
it's good to be back. Thanks, Johan.
Lucky to chat again. So, today we're going to talk about cloud. And the topic is to have a cloud operating model. But before we get to a cloud operating model, if I say to you that many, if not most, of the people that I speak to that has gone to cloud are on a scale a little bit disappointed to disillusioned, what would your response be?
I can see why. Cloud can be a massive shift for many people from a mindset perspective, from just a practical application perspective. I think a lot of people can sometimes go into cloud with a bit of cotton over their eyes and realize afterwards what cloud actually meant. There's been a lot of mixed sales pitches, I guess, that have landed very strongly with customers, and they're not entirely the truth now that people are starting to use it more maturely, etc. now. But then on the other hand, there are other customers that have taken to it very natively and have leveraged it very powerfully to do things they weren't really able to do before. So definitely see it. But yeah, there's definitely success cases out there as well.
Yeah, I'm not debating the fact that there's success cases. I mean, the next question I normally ask people, so will you go back to your data center? And the answer is no. Yeah. So clearly the pain is not that much.
Something's obviously working, yeah.
Yeah, but I think the big shocker for them was most probably the cost implications of the move.
For most, yes.
And maybe that brings us to today's topic, the fact that you need a cloud operating model and a cloud strategy for that matter, before you sign the contract.
Yeah, there's I guess a whole process of learning. It's a tricky one. It's that there's a lot of chicken before egg. Some things we see very, very frequently is customers have gone and started a POC in the cloud, and next minute it's not a POC. It's like people are using it. And so, oh dear, we haven't put any governance around it. We haven't actually moved it to production. It just suddenly became production because people thought it worked great. And so yeah, everyone's journey is a little different on their entry to cloud, and it's a learning journey. And you there's a massive trust thing that comes into play, because now suddenly you're on this journey with a partner, your cloud service provider, whoever that would be, and there's a lot of trust and a lot of clarity that needs to be drawn between the two, and a lot of learning that needs to take place. around how things work in the cloud. You're essentially outsourcing a very, very large part of your operations to someone else to manage. And I think that's sometimes lost in understanding for customers. Working for Microsoft, I got to see, I've worked on both sides, right? I've worked for companies prior to Microsoft. I got to see how they operate, and then when joining Microsoft, it was very interesting to see how there's an expectation that the cloud service provider is supposed to get, we want to see your incident process, and we want to see how you're doing this, and you're like, no, it's not how the cloud works. We're providing you the service, so you don't need to worry about that kind of stuff. But then you need to integrate it properly within your environment to make sure that you don't run into challenges, etc. So there is definitely a way of operations that needs to be reviewed when you do that. On an interesting point, though, I don't know, and this is a contentious point. This is a Richard's perspective that I feel very strongly about, and I've had several debates with several people around it. But is there really such thing as a cloud operating model? If you've already got an operating model, do you suddenly add another one called a cloud operating model, and then a digital operating model, and then a...
Yeah, it's the same question of how many management systems can an organization have? And the answer should be one, but you cannot expect that your old operating model will be the same as your new operating model.
Absolutely. But I think there's a perception that generally a cloud operating model is an addition to your current operating model, and that's not the case. And I usually, because there's a mindset that comes with that there's a split between how things should work. And there's definitely a split between the ways of working on premise versus the way you will work in the cloud. But you're essentially using the vast majority of your existing resources, assets, and processes. You're not creating an entirely new organization to run the cloud. So therefore, my argument is, if an operating model, and we defined what that was, if an operating model was a collection of your resources, your assets, your processes, your partners, and everything else, it's the way you structure and configure that in order for you to deliver against your strategic objectives. Then I could argue that, well, if you're going to put a cloud operating model in there, you're essentially going to need a whole new set of people, processes, and so forth. And that really doesn't happen. So how I've tried to at least grasp the concept is, when you go to cloud, you're essentially having to clearly understand what services you're planning on providing from whatever platform you're adopting. And you need to create a service wrapper around that. And that service wrapper is like your operating model, but it's how you're going to configure your current processes, train your current people, etc., to enable you to work with the cloud. So I'll give you an example. So operating models are made up of things called capabilities. And a capability is your ability to do something. So financial management, as an organization, you're enabled to manage your finances. How you do that effectively or not is based on your health of your process, your people's training, and the tools you're using, etc. So every capability is made up of people, process, technologies, and partners. And anyone who's ever read an ITIL book, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I raise those, right? And it's true. I mean, so for financial management, you've got accountants, you've got financial managers, you've got a variety of other roles that need to make sure that they bring a certain skill set and knowledge to the table. And you've got a financial management process, you've got accounting practices, you've got your budgeting practices, etc. And then you've got various solutions that you might be using to automate and manage your finances. And then you've got partners that you're going to be partnering with to either provision these technologies, or perhaps you've outsourced your aspects of your financial management, etc. So that's all bundled in your ability to manage finances. Now, looking across an operating model, there's a plethora of different capabilities you are likely to have. There's support management, your ability to manage support, your ability to manage change, IT change, your ability to manage. So I've bundled the ability to manage change as IT change and people change, because it's synonymous for me. The practices are different, but at a capability, your ability to do change would encompass business, project, IT, etc. And essentially, the point I'm getting to is when you move to the cloud, you've currently got change practices in your organization. You've currently got support capabilities in your organization, but support works a little different in the cloud. So now that means you have to look at your existing ability to manage support. And you might realize that, wait a minute, it doesn't necessarily fit with the speed of cloud, for example. Maybe it's got many different escalation paths and it's maybe not as streamlined as it could be. And you've got all these product groups now because you're doing all this fancy stuff. Now you're going into cloud and it's, well, how do you optimize this to make sure that, when there's an issue with your cloud provider, how will you know? And how do you get it addressed as quickly as possible? And so reviewing the way in which you do support management today, there's obviously some new practices and so forth that the cloud brings with it, how you integrate from a technology layer to your cloud provider to get automated updates when something fails, or how do you initiate a bridge between key contact personnel with your cloud service provider and your key contact personnel? How do you manage incidents through the lifecycle? Because there's going to be because Microsoft will, your cloud service provider is going to manage the incidents on their side against their SLAs. And then, of course, you need to manage the incident and communications on your side. So what does that partnership look like? And that needs to be defined. Because what we find very often is across any capability, and you can look at any capability across your operating model, and I can almost bet you there's going to be a touch of outsourcing that's going to happen to your cloud service provider or whoever is providing your cloud services. And what you're needing to do is you're needing to define how you're going to, if you're providing value through how you provide support as a capability, or you're providing value through how you do your strategy or your requirements management or your building management, etc. How are you going to co-create value with your provider in every single one of those areas? And so that is essentially what I think making your operating model, making it more cloud centric would be involved, is it's really looking at where you're at today, where you're assessing each capability and then reviewing, well, where are the gaps in terms of what good could look like with the use of cloud and with our skill sets, the types of people we've hired, the processes we're using, can they be automated, the typical age old, how do we optimize? There's new steps in your process to consider that your cloud provider might have that you need to consider, and so on and so on. So essentially that's...
So is it fair to say that you need to determine in each one of these capabilities what are the boundary of trust?
When you say the boundary of trust,
when are you going to trust your provider to do it, and when are you not going to trust them to provide it? That means
question.
you need to do it.
It's a good question. So I think, and I like that question because that there are a lot of organizations that struggle a lot with the notion that you've moved to the cloud, and the cloud works the way the cloud works. Your cloud service provider has an SLA, and it starts and it stops there. And I'd argue that your experience across any cloud provider is going to be fairly similar in that regard. It doesn't matter who you're with, and all cloud providers are providing, substantially good services around. It's difficult to pin one off the other as being excelling in that. The trust element's a tricky one because it's contractual. So if your cloud service provider is saying to you, you're going to get 98% availability on something, you need to design your architecture and you need to design the way you're going to, it's raw materials, right? So and bear with me when you'll hear what I'm getting to. So you're essentially buying raw materials to create a service from your cloud provider. You don't get a cloud hosting, IaaS service from your cloud and immediately just give it to your end users. You have to configure it and you have to build the governance around it and publish it and so forth in order for them to consume it. So essentially your cloud providers are still just providing you with raw material. And that raw material is in the shape of IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS services, and each one has its contractual SLAs, etc. The trust thing's a difficult one for me because you have to define what trust is, Johan, I think. I mean,
Okay, so
and I meant it for the individual, because
yeah,
we've got, I've got customers that are adamant that, they want to manage change a certain way. You're like, but you can't anymore, because that's not how it works. Your cloud service provider is going to tell you when a change is going to happen, and it's going to happen. No, we don't work like that. Well, your cloud provider is not going to change their entire global operations to facilitate you being able to decide when you want to put a change through. There's a degree of practicality that comes with cloud. It's a globally sourced service. It's not you don't get special treatment in the cloud unless you are a massive, massive strategic enterprise organization. And so yeah,
yeah, but I would argue even then it's not going to be that different.
it's not. It really isn't. There might be uh it's they get access to maybe a little bit closer relationship with product groups and stuff, and many customers have got access to that already. But essentially, yeah, there's a line that gets drawn where it's like, well, you can't. The service is what it is. We've got customers who complain about the I find organizations who complain about the fact that they've got a specific they talk about their downtime needing to be a specific amount. They're very adamant that we've got targets that need to be met, operational targets that need to be met, and you're going to have to step up your game as cloud service provider to make sure that those are met. And you're like, well, it's not quite how it works. Again, it's you either, if you've got that level of target that you need to meet, maybe you should remain on premise. If you're not comfortable being in the cloud, then don't go to the cloud. It boils down to the way you architect it. And if your architecture will work in the cloud and it's redundant enough, and you're using the correct architecture to get redundancy on multiple regions, etc., then great. Then the cloud will work. But if you've got a workload that is just absolutely massive targets for availability, and sometimes you need to make the hard choice and say it's probably best to remain on premise for that then.
Yeah, but here's the joke about it. I mean, the likelihood that somebody is actually going to have availability figures that's higher than cloud availability figures doing things on-prem over a period of time is zero.
Exactly. I find that a lot as well.
So it's about just unrealistic expectations, making promises that you should have never made.
And I think, and that's kind of getting back to that point about, well, what is trust? It's trust's important to be able to. It's something. Trust's a tricky one, because trust is an emotional aspect. And when you're approaching the crowd, you have to be very much fact driven when you're looking at what the actual figures were. What was the past performance for a cloud provider in a certain regard? So you can measure up to say, yes, we'll be safe based on previous performance, et cetera, et cetera. But always remember, you're going to a cloud service. Things can happen. And it's a global service. So,
but much less likely than it would with your own.
Correct. Yeah.
The reason why I'm talking about that boundary of trust is many people say that, okay, I'm in the cloud now, and I'm sort of also handed over to. I've got no ability to do anything anymore, and that's not true either. Yeah. So just as there's certain things that your cloud provider won't do for you, there's also things that you can do because you don't trust your cloud provider to do that on your behalf.
Well, Netflix was a perfect case in point for that, because what Netflix did was there was a massive outage with their cloud provider, where it took down bulk of their regional sites, and they were one of the only customers that weren't affected or recorded an impact on assessing why. It's because they architected with the knowledge that if this goes down, what are we going to do? And again, so I lead it back to the point of the architecture side of things. Like, if you're going to move to cloud, you have to build in the scenario that your cloud provider may stop working. The likelihood, it's a case of probability. What's the probability of happening? It can the risk is absolutely there. The probability is probably low, but it does happen. So You have to
Yeah, but
architect accordingly.
I think the Netflix example was E2 that went down, but it wasn't all of it. Um,
It wasn't all of it. You're
so
right.
so
Because
so so net,
they'd spread their
yeah,
architecture, right? Yeah,
yes, and Netflix architected their way of operating to be able to lose a region or two or three and still
exactly.
continue
Yeah.
to operate. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's
Um,
a carry on. Sorry, yeah.
no, so but that's the point that I'm trying to make with that boundary of trust is don't assume just because you're going to the cloud that you can't do anything, and you also can't. You have to do everything that your cloud provider is telling you. There's just certain things that they're not going to do for you because that's not their capability. And if
Exactly.
it's not their capability, then you best develop that capability.
Exactly.
My question to you now is if we talk about capabilities, which capabilities are more important now than what they were when everybody was on prem?
Good question. So I think that your vendor management, partner management type of supplier management, depending on the size of your organization, because I think the bigger you are, the more important that becomes in managing the relationship with your cloud service provider. But that's going to be an important one because you're now managing a lot of, as I said, a lot of your operating model is going to be outsourced. So that relationship, that trust element needs to be very clearly nurtured and developed. So that's going to be one. I think another very important one, and I think it's you're enabled to do more on the cloud with this, but also bringing this one in from the fact that we're looking at moving into recession, but financial management and cloud cost management, FinOps is a very important one as well, so that you're making sure that you're managing your cost. And we always say, you don't spend less by moving to the cloud. You're going to spend more because it's about how you optimize your spend. So you have to manage and continually optimize how your cloud spend works. The reality is your bill is going to carry on going up. Why? Because more and more people are going to start using the cloud, and you can do more in the cloud. So more workloads will get up. So your bill will continue to increase. You're needing to optimize the spend on an ongoing basis and have the capability to do that. So know exactly how to manage cloud costs on whatever cloud platform you're using.
Okay.
Support change management's an exceptionally important one because in the cloud, everything's what we call evergreen, which means that your cloud providers now push changes to your environment. That you don't get to sit in a cab and decide whether you will or you won't. You do on some licensed products, but otherwise the update's going to happen whether you like them or not because it's a global service. We can't have change windows for every single customer, right? And so you need to ensure that you are reviewing very regularly all the upcoming changes with your cloud provider and have and create a sort of a triage process to your existing change process that works on contextualizing all those changes to your organization's risk. So what will the impact of these changes that the provider is pushing through be to you? What steps do you need to take to mitigate those risks or smoothen things out? And then using standard change models to push those all through because you can't bottleneck your advisory
Yeah.
meetings
And
and
the
so forth.
reality is that one of your most useful tools in the past you don't have anymore. You can't roll back what the
Ex
provider did.
exactly, exactly right. So, I mean, I mean, it's this stuff's been working for many, many years, and so a lot of people who have touched on the cloud already know that. But that's a stronger capability that needs to really be in place.
Mhm.
Support's another one because, of course, you're sharing support with someone else now. So how do you integrate with them and make sure you're streamlining that? I'd like to think service monitoring, you need to understand end to end how your services are going to be monitored. We tend to find very frequently when we get to the monitoring discussion, we just get lost in, oh, he has about 8,000 tools and we use this one for that and this one for this. And I think what's needed in the industry is to take a step back from all the cool stuff we can do in monitoring and just focus again based on the essentials. what is the service? What do I need to what are all the service asset classes or service assets for that service that make it up end to end? And how am I going to monitor each one of those? And how do I roll that monitoring up into a dashboard so I can see the health of my services? Because often it's just this global boom, let's monitor the whole lot and look at this cool AI stuff we can do and the patterns we can do. And it's all great stuff, and it's all, I mean, really great stuff. But I found very often engaged with organizations, they've kind of just gone, they've run away with it without and lost track of, well, how are you going to tell me that this particular service is running healthily? And the cool thing with the cloud is you've got insights and you've got the barriers that you had with monitoring before. You no longer have. You can monitor on-prem and cloud. All that your cloud service providers have ways to blend your monitoring across both. So you truly do get that single pane of glass view. And you've got your IaaS monitoring, you've got your application monitoring, and all this stuff can sort of roll up into a full stack of monitoring that it was not easy to do before. So, and I think that's why it kind of everyone loses their focus in it, because there's just so much cool stuff. So I think that's another one that's a really important one. Your strategy is also pretty important, and I think because architecture is another very important one. How do you architect for the cloud? How do you do high availability? How do you build in resilience and continuity? How do all those new mechanics in the cloud work? And strategy, of course, I think that's another big one. I very often see we've got a cloud first strategy, and while I understand the reason for it, and if I saw David Cannon might be joining the session, if he's on there, he'll be laughing to himself because I always get on my soapbox of this one. But what does that even mean for an organization? So the people on the ground, it's cloud first. Okay, so we're throwing everything in cloud. Well, that's not necessarily a good strategy. Again, I get the intent. We need to shift our focus to the cloud. I know why it was there. But strategy and the cloud should be a lot more crisp and clear. Like, what are you trying to do? What are the objectives? Why are you first for cloud? What are you trying to achieve by being first for cloud? Is it reduction in cost? Well, that's a whole different angle we need to go at it, because throwing everything at the cloud is definitely not going to help with that. So it's taking those old ways of let's just get everyone to move to cloud, and reviewing that and trying to find out how can we be very clear around what are we strategically trying to do with the cloud, and how is that enabling the organizational strategic objectives? And it's astounding as to how much ambiguity exists around that across many organizations today. And it's when we're talking about an operating model, if you don't have clarity around your strategic objectives, if you can't break them down into 5 clear objectives that can then have key results associated to them with metrics and so forth, how on earth are you going to configure an operating model? What are you configuring it up against? For example, if an organization's got a strategic objective, and many are going to get this one, we have to save costs. It's an imperative. Great. Financial management is going to be a key capability to enable that. So what's our current ability to manage finance in the cloud and FinOps? Maybe it's poor. Okay, what are the gaps? How do we get those addressed? Let's get working on that now. Architecture management will be another one. How do we architect our solutions and size them correctly for the cloud so they don't consume a significant amount of cost? Where are the gaps with that? What's our current ability to do that effectively? Your design, so your design ability to design solutions, kind of, architecture sets the standards and so forth. You get where I'm going with it. So, there's...
I mean, for me, if you look at the old traditional processes, we always battled so much in terms of making sure that things are available. But we did pretty little from a proactive perspective. Similarly, we spent so much time on measuring performance of stuff, but very little in terms of understanding demand and load as a result of demand. Now, if you don't do those 3 things well, your cost is going to run away with you.
And the beauty of the cloud is that's all transparent. You get to see that.
And it's there's no surprises there. If you do stupid stuff, you're going to pay for it.
I've seen some. I wouldn't label it as stupid, but I've seen people, over the evening, a cube would be instantiated in the cloud or whatever else, or whatever it might be. They'll come down the next day and suddenly there's like a 30 grand bill waiting at their door because someone accidentally spun up a machine learning model, and this thing was running overnight, and it generated a substantial amount of cost. So these things happen quite easily in the cloud. That's
well, I call that stupid stuff. You need to be really, really careful when you flip that little switch. Yeah, it's a click of a mouse now. It's not even that. It's not even tacit anymore.
And again, speaks to having a proper cloud operating model in place, having correct governance in place. Who's got access to what? Who's able to do that? Are it's those all speak to the reason why you have to take a step back and review. Things work differently now in the cloud. So the way you're doing things today, how do you go about changing and configuring those things to be a little bit more aligned to the new ways of working, so to speak? And you partner with your cloud provider for that. You go and you do send some specialists on training for that, etc.
Can you see David Cannon's comments on the screen?
I'm busy reading it through it now. So I agree. If you're looking for always on levels of the cloud, is the best option for trying to do it.
Which one can you see? The white one, or can you see the sidebar?
I see a big one on the screen.
Okay, so let's see what this is. I don't know what to do. Exit full screen. See, I can't see how to go on with that. All right. Let's see. If I do this. However, systems are unique to an organization that requires specialized knowledge from small groups of people and are used to specific scenarios. Always on is not the most important performance criteria. Availability, criterion. Available in this situation to this level, and why level of. Okay, I don't quite get that. David, shorter sentences, but okay, I don't know how to see everything because it runs out of my big screen also.
But essentially, I get what David's saying. It's availability is not the major criteria that we use, and David can correct me if I've interpreted it wrong. But I mean, I think that was a huge major measure for us on-prem. Availability was a massive thing. It's important in the cloud, but always on and available is not your key metric, as much as before. It's because you're getting better. You typically should be getting better availability in the cloud, and it's better, easier to manage, I say.
And better performance also.
Exactly.
But the difficult thing in the cloud is to translate your old ITIL language patterns of business activity into load and the cost of load.
And you get if you're measuring your consumption across all. So I mean, your cloud provider's got a bunch of SKUs. We'll call them SKUs, just services that they have within their IaaS catalog, etc., like VMs or VNets or whatever else, and each has got associated consumption, so you can see what's being consumed, at a given time, or what computers, or memory usages or whatever. I mean, SaaS, PaaS, they've all got these consumption metrics associated, and if you're able to. You're able to see the demand based on what's being utilized on a month-to-month basis, and it's about optimizing. So it's, to your point, with demand management, it's again like a big win for cost management is turn your machines off in the evenings if no one's using them.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Massive cost savings, just waiting at your fingertips if you're not doing that. So it's you get far more. I think you've got a lot more clarity on demand in the cloud. Maybe not up front, but you can see what the demand is sort of afterwards.
And Mohammed, just speaks to the question that you've posed is you're not at the mercy of the cloud provider. You absolutely at the mercy of yourself. But if you're not diligent in understanding the consequences of decisions that you make and things that you switch on and switch off and use and don't use and whatever, it's going to cost you a ton of money. You see, in the old days, in on-prem, we always expect platforms to be over capacity.
Yeah? Exactly. Yep.
And and if you forget to do something and you realize 2 days later that you're running out of capacity on the server, then you can always switch something off. But if you do that on the cloud, you still get the bill.
I'd say a good analogy to what Mohammed was saying and what you were saying is that your cloud provider is essentially giving you a Learjet, or a 747 or whatever else. You get in the cockpit, it's yours. Here's the keys. You've got access to it. That's what you've got. You need to know how to fly that thing. Your cloud provider's giving you the ability to, but we're
all
not
the tools, all the training.
You want the tools. You want the tools. Here's the training. Here's the flight manual. We're not going to jam that down your throat. We're not going to come and hold your hand through it unless you pay us to. It's because you want to do X and Y. Here's all the tools to do X and Y. So here's your 747. Here's the keys. If you don't know, if you're not a certified pilot and you don't know how to fly a 747 and you don't know how to use all the controls in the cockpit, well, you
can always idle it on the runway and still pay for the fuel.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely right. But yeah, there's that mind. I think there's that mindset shift that it happens for many, but yeah, I think essentially it's just taking a step back and realizing that everything that you do, there's this co-creation that needs to happen, and you kind of need to think about whether or not, when you view your organization in terms of your ability to do X, Y, Z, and if you don't have a capability model, get online and search for one and start from there. It's not supposed to be rocket science. Just as a diagram, just a checklist. These are all the things we do as an organization. Right now, in this instance, from a cloud perspective, what should we know? And if you don't have the answers, speak to your cloud provider. Say, look, we'd like some guidance around how we partner in these areas and what that might look like, and they'll be happy to help you with that, because that's part of the engagement you have. If you're a small organization, then you probably need to do some digging up and some reading if you don't have access to support contracts and so forth with your big cloud providers. But essentially, the principle remains. It's a really good exercise to sit down and go through all of what you do as an organization, all up, not just for cloud, and review what the difference in cloud might be, and make note of those and try and use that as a point to remediate how you.
Yeah, I think that's also an interesting observation, is that the fact that very little transformation is driven in organizations is driven by the availability of technology. Technology is only an accelerator. And if you thought that going to cloud is going to enable your organization to do a bunch of other stuff without changing your business model, and not changing the way that you do things on the front end, then you're sorely mistaken. Yeah, you're not going to get that benefit. I always used to sort of chuckle at this notion of two-speed IT, but I sometimes wonder if how much of the performance capability that we've built in IT in the last 10, 15 years is just wasted because nothing has happened on the front end. Nothing has happened in terms of the way that we do business, the way that we engage with customers, the way that we service customers. And I'm not talking about IT now. I'm talking about the business.
Oh, don't even get me started there. I mean, something that made me chuckle is I was reading a great book by someone named Joe Peppard. He's a researcher, was with MIT, and he's written some really great publications. And sort of alluding to the fact that we somehow, it's sort of in all the books that have been published on best practice for IT and so forth, there's been this notion that business has its ducks in a row and how you deliver value to business. Business doesn't have a cooking clue what value they're looking for, and they certainly don't have their ducks in a row. So when you're looking at financial finance departments and stuff in many organizations, that they can be a mess. The way they do their costing across the whole business, for example, and you've got different business units that aren't following the same practices, and there's I think there's this view that no, business has their act together, and here's IT now need to try and serve them. But part of the challenge is that IT, who are trying to figure out how to best deliver cloud services and services in general, are engaging with an organization that also doesn't necessarily have its facts together or structured itself right. And it's these two worlds of chaos that kind of collide, and you kind of have to figure out the nuance around how to work effectively together to get to the right outcomes. And I'm telling you, having clarity on what the business strategic objectives are and what the IT strategic objectives are and how they align is like a pivotal first step. I mean, that's 101 in terms of any management book you read, right? And somehow we just don't seem to be getting, that 100% correct still today. But yeah, I've always enjoyed the paradigm of that business and that IT side. They've got a lot of they sometimes don't do things near as structured as what IT might do, for example.
Yeah, and unfortunately, IT has allowed the business to think that technology is the answer to every business problem, and technology solves nothing. If the person and the driving the thing needs to solve it first in terms of structured and strategic thought, and then we can figure out how technology can enable that.
I don't disagree with it, but I challenge it from this perspective. I think if the new world that I can slowly see rolling out from my very narrow perspective is when you've got a business division and you've got some tech savvy users in that business division, and you've got things like low code application development rolling out at your fingertips, a Power Platform, for example, and so forth, they intrinsically can see a challenge, and without a formal approach to finding a gap in the industry or whatever else, can quickly spin something together and suddenly, hey, look, it's providing significant value, and then slowly formalize that, and now you've got this new product, right?
Granted, but where did it start, Richard? Did it start with a low code platform or with a person that saw the opportunity?
The reason why I challenged it is because the person who saw the opportunity, if they didn't have the tech, if they didn't understand how to develop in low code, or they weren't tech savvy, they might not have seen that opportunity because
Sure enough. But
that's what I
technology
mean.
is still the enabler.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
The point I'm making is, so you're right. I'm not disputing that, but what I'm saying is that business, that business divide between business and technology, the real leaders in the market are the people who get technology but are the business people. They can see an opportunity, and immediately it's an opportunity because they immediately know it. Wow, if we use it to plug this in here and code that there, that's a market we can serve because the other people can't see that.
Okay.
And it doesn't happen by you going into a room with a bunch of developers and technologists and saying, hey, I'm from business, I've got this great idea, how can we make something around that? It comes from someone who's got the dualistic approach of they get the technology, they get the business, and the solution becomes obvious.
But it also can only happen in organizations whose business model allows for that type of actions.
That's a whole different discussion. Exactly right. So, and
that's why, this book that I've just posted now, Unlocking Customer Value, the Customer Value Chain by Tels Teixeira, absolute brilliant read. If you haven't read it, read it. And I mean, his research, so he sort of built on Christensen's early work, and he's also an academic. They see over and over and over, the organizations that excel is not, the first innovation was not a technology innovation, it was a business process or a business model innovation. And then they knew how to leverage technology for the organization's greatest effect. And I love it because, as I've said for quite some time, I'm getting sick and tired of digital transformation. I wish businesses would start transforming because digital is smart enough.
Stop talking about it and
yeah. So let's see. I faced an organization. We've got a full solution hosted in the cloud. Got regulation to have DR side, contracted provider. He was able to do so. Mike on-prem as DR solution. So this moment, as he. Okay, so unfortunately, there are some legislative challenges, especially around the issue of which type of data is held.
Data sovereignty, yeah.
Yeah. So,
cloud providers.
And I know that the banks are struggling with it, but
they are, but they're not, Johan, because there's been massive progress in the last 5 years from cloud service providers and how they enabled effective data sovereignty, and it's ongoing. So creating cloud for government, so government entirely cloud just for government organizations, and the same for education, and there's obviously a few more, military, etc. So while it is an absolute factor on whether or not you can move to the cloud, is knowing where your data resides and how it's managed, and cloud providers are pretty good at giving you the details around how that all works, and how it gets managed from the cloud provider's perspective as well. But it's nowhere near as much of an inhibitor as before. All global banks that I know are on the cloud with that exact criterion, that they've got very, very clear data sovereignty requirements and compliance that need to be met, and they're being met, and they're successful. And this is globally, so that's not just in Europe. It's throughout. So while there are likely one or two scenarios, one or two, there'll probably be a lot more, but while there are likely a couple of scenarios where cloud is just not the, you might have blockers that prevent you from being able to use the cloud given the sensitivity of certain types of information. It's not near an inhibitor like it used to be.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so what you're basically telling us is that you shouldn't have a cloud operating model. You should change your operating model to be cloud compatible. You should understand the strategic choices that you make when going to the cloud. Understand that you will have to develop certain capabilities that you may not have now, and that other capabilities that you may be brilliant at would most probably become worthless, which is always a sad thing, but that's change.
I don't think there's been cases where I've seen a capability become worthless. Depends on the granularity you're going to in terms of your capabilities, but very high level. They're all, if you look at a value chain and all the steps that need to happen in order for you to provide value as a service, strategy, design, build and transition, operate, manage and govern, that's all relevant in the cloud. Absolutely, more so than ever.
I do, though, think that there's a lot of, your server management capabilities that's less important in the way that you build those capabilities. So it doesn't mean that the people can't be used to go and do something else and learn new capabilities when they go to the cloud. But some people, when you move to the cloud, they will feel that, I'm really good at this and now I can't do it anymore.
From a technology capability perspective, there might be some, I agree, that would fall away or shift or change. But I'd also argue, and I'd sort of press on with organizations to try ironically, not focus on technical capabilities. Those will become apparent through time. Try and focus on your organizational capabilities when you're looking at an operating model. The technology capabilities are, they're subsets, they're supporting capabilities to, for example, financial management, automation management, which is a technical capability, is something that can support financial management. Don't try and view the operating model from a mix of business or organization and technology, because it'll just get super confusing. It's just looking at, you know, how do you strategize? So strategy and innovation, design being requirements management and design management, change management, build management, a test release management, support management, provisioning management. I could go through a list, but those are all operational kinds of capabilities, not technical, if that makes sense.
Okay, before we wrap up, last comment or question from a user. You mentioned change in cabs earlier. Where now the cloud provider can make changes without prior approval from every client. Any advice on how customers adapt their operating model to handle that? I suppose how they change the change in configuration processes predominantly.
So that's a great question. And so the first thing would be, as a transitionary step, right? Because you'll evolve thereafter. But as an initial transitionary step, my recommendation would be you'd need to create a high-level triage process. So you need to be far more proactive with your change efforts, in the sense that you have to go and read up about all of the changes that are coming towards you and when they're expected to come. Yeah. And you need to go and look at, well, you need to go and define risk categories for those changes, contextualized to your organization. So you can't just slap a category on saying a change that your cloud provider is doing will mean one thing to one company and a completely different thing to you in terms of risk profile. So you have to create risk categories that you can then go and bucket these cloud changes into. And there needs to be a change model defined for each one of those categories. So if you've got a very high risk category, it's likely going to still result in you having a CAB meeting just to, again, you can't stop the change, but there are probably a couple of things that need to be more formally managed because the change is a little bit more unknown, the impact's a little more unknown. So you get a committee together to figure out how to go and best manage that change before it happens. The rest should be standard changes that kind of just get pushed through, and part of that standard change will be communications to end users, and things like that. Most changes in the cloud, you're able to semi-preview prior to them going live in your tenants. So there's that buffering for you to get a feel for what it's like beforehand. So that all needs to be formed part of your change process. And you can use your traditional process for that, because you're really just you're trying to circumvent the CAB and only using it for essential things. But there needs to be an all-up understanding from the entire change management team that you cannot decline a change in the cloud. So with
so
that
your only response can be, so what are we going to do about it?
How do we minimize impact?
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly. And as you say, Richard, so it's not that we don't have any view of those things.
No, you have to. If you don't, that's a massive problem.
And the cloud providers are very transparent, and most of the time, this is really good advance notice that you get of things coming down the pipeline. So it's not that you're oblivious and something happens to you.
Exactly. And if things like that do happen, and it's been known to happen before, I mean, things happen in any organization, then you escalate it to your cloud service provider and request for them to investigate and get back to you on that. And it's this back and forth, but it shouldn't be happening, right? It should be an exception more than the norm. The other element is your configuration management is a really interesting topic, because do you even need a CMDB when you've gone to the cloud? Because essentially you're able to get all the information like you've never had before in the cloud. And my response to that is, when you're looking at certain SaaS applications that still have a client on a desktop, then yes, it's probably beneficial to keep your CMDB, because when those changes get rolled out, you need to try and manage the impact of those across your asset base. So your CMDB should have those client devices, and so you can see from an impact perspective on when I say on-premise, you might have your CMDB in the cloud, but all your devices and being able to keep those attributes up to date with all the latest changes from your cloud service provider might be important, because you won't get that from a cloud service provider's view. Your asset that you might find when you're trending it, that certain types of laptops, for example, don't agree with the new update. And that will be something you would trend through your CMDB. You're not going to get that in the cloud. When you've got a whole lot of VMs and an entire environment, do you need those in your CMDB? Unless, probably, exactly. So unless there is, what we typically recommend is look at your end-to-end service, try and define what the service asset classes are. So not the assets themselves, but certain builds or things like that, and consider those as CMDB attributes, so that you know what kinds of asset classes will be impacted, as opposed to individual machines from a cloud perspective. And so what it really needs is you need to look at a totally new CMDB strategy. What are the service asset classes that will be represented in your CMDB for, you'd have to justify why they should be kept in sync. And then when you look at and what attributes are going to be important for the cloud for those asset classes, etc. And then if you're going to get really fancy, when you're starting to do updates to your VM environments and things like that, you want to start using things called pipelines and automation. And part of that can actually update your CMDB. We call it declarative CMDB, declarative configuration management, where you're actually publishing those changes to the CMDB while it's instantiating into the cloud itself. And so you're keeping a record of both worlds, essentially. So any changes that happen go through a pipeline, automatically configures your CMDB. But yeah.
So I find it hard to listen to you using the term CMDB rather than a CMS.
Caught me there, Johan.
But I think another thing that you also need to bear in mind is that with the move to cloud, software configuration management is becoming much more important than knowing about end devices and all the BS that we kept ourselves busy with previously. Okay, we've got 3 minutes left. 5 things that an CIO must do to get the most out of their cloud strategy.
5 things. So I think the first one is ensure that there's clarity around how there's a cloud strategy, cloud strategic objectives outline and highlighting how they align to the other organizational strategies that are in place is the first one. You need clear strategic direction. The second one is evaluate your current operating model and try and identify and determine what is needed to be successful in the cloud. So what does support in cloud look like? What does architecture management in cloud look like, etc. And what does and try and determine what those gaps are and build a transformation roadmap based on the remediation of all the gaps that you can find. Try and really beef up your financial management capability. And that's going to also require beefing up of architecture and your ability to manage costs from that perspective, as well as your change management capability as well. Those are 3. Try and leverage your cloud provider's insights as much as possible. Integrate to as many monitoring endpoints and so forth that they provide as you can to understand the health of services and the proactive nature of how those work. I'd also recommend, as part of that discussion, make sure you've got a major incident response plan in place with your cloud service provider, so when things do go wrong, there's a clear process around how you and them will work together to remediate those issues and so forth. The 5th thing is, I would recommend trying to slot your cloud provider in as a strategic provider. Because essentially, given the fact that you're outsourcing most of your capabilities to them without you knowing it, their insights and their guidance are going to prove pivotal for the success in cloud for you as an organization. And I would even take it as far as to try and include them in your strategic management sessions to try and understand. I mean, obviously there's the internal strategic sessions, and then there's looking at your cloud providers strategically to say, What's on the horizon? Where do you see what are your other types of customers doing in this space? Leverage your cloud service providers experience in certain industry and so forth, or what other customers are doing, and how you can do things in a more effective way to drive strategic decision making and so forth moving forward. So I'd say those would be my top of hand 5
Awesome.
things I'd say focus
Richard,
on.
as always, been a pleasure, mate.
Always is.
I'm going to ask you to hang around while we're closing off the session. It is 1 minute and 9 seconds. Thank you to everybody that was listening and that's still going to listen. I hope you had fun. And number 2, I hope you learned a lot. Let me quickly just do some other stuff. If you want to have a chat with Richard, there's some information about him. So on LinkedIn, it's Richard de Kock, one word, or richard.dekock@outlook.com. And you can also listen to him tweeting and stirrings from time to time, Reach DK. Richard, once again, thanks a stack. And then
it's a pleasure,
asking you guys to remember that there's a bunch of other people that we've spoken to also. You can always go and watch past episodes. If you go to our page, for some reason today all of the videos is not there, just go to streams and you will find all the previous live streams. And then a reminder to join us on Instagram and to go and like our page there. We're trying to build an Instagram following, and the Adapt books is still available. Cool. Now I need to jump back here, and in 2 weeks' time, or 3 weeks' time, actually, we're going to do the last Get It for the year. And I'm going to be a bit of a stirrer, and I'm going to see how many of the certification providers we can get on the session, and ask the question, is certification at a crossroads? Hope you'll join us there, and good night.